It began as a bold experiment. We'd been married for 10 years, and though we loved each other, there was this itch we couldn't seem to scratch. Our lives had slipped into a routine, a comfortable, almost suffocating rhythm that left us feeling, at least a little like we were missing out. We'd talked about opening our marriage before, usually in passing, but the idea had always hovered as a what if, something that lived in late-night conversations after a few glasses of wine and was easily dismissed in the morning. Yet one night we took that idea and made it real. I remember the way we sat across from each other, nervous but excited, as we discussed the rules. We told ourselves it would be a test of trust, of our connection, something that would make us stronger in the end. We agreed on honesty, transparency,
no secrets.
We would tell each other about anyone else we might be seeing and keep each other as our priority, our anchor. For the first few months, the arrangement was almost thrilling in its novelty. I dipped my toes in carefully, seeing someone for coffee here, sharing a drink there. Each new encounter was invigorating in its own way, but nothing ever reached the depths of what I had with him. And that's what I told myself over and over. He was my husband, my best friend, my home. There was no real threat. Yet I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a flicker of jealousy in me whenever he went out. I would watch him get dressed, the way he took an extra moment to pick out a shirt or fix his hair. There was a spark in his eyes, a little glow of excitement I hadn't seen in years. It stung to know he was going to be with someone else, to imagine someone else touching him the way I did. But I swallowed it, reminding myself that this was something we'd chosen, together. I'd agreed to this, hadn't I? I wanted this. At least that's what I told myself. Over time, though, something started to shift. I don't remember when exactly it happened. Perhaps it was the first time he came back late, or the first time he forgot to mention something like a text that popped up on his phone, lighting up his face in the darkness. We'd promised to be honest, but this new world we'd opened up seemed to be breeding secrets between us like shadows creeping in, uninvited and unaddressed. I found myself asking more questions, feeling a desperation to fill in the blanks that seemed to be forming around him. And each time he brushed me off with that casual, practiced ease, something cracked inside me. And then there was Damon. I met him at a friend's party. A stranger with a warm smile and deep eyes that seemed to see right through me. He wasn't like the others. I wasn't just drawn to him physically, though that was certainly part of it. There was something in the way he listened, how he remembered small things about me, asking questions that went deeper than what I'd grown used to. With him, I felt seen, understood in a way I hadn't in a long time. And soon our little coffee dates turned into something else. A late-night call here, a shared laugh there, until I found myself sneaking out, heart-pounding, to see him. At first, I thought I was managing it well. I could keep both, my husband, my life, and this thrilling secret thing with Damon. But it started to seep into my marriage in ways I hadn't anticipated. I caught myself comparing, wondering, weighing my feelings for each of them in a kind of twisted mental balance that made me feel dizzy. And then one night, after Damon kissed me goodbye, I came home to my husband sitting up, waiting. His face was a mixture of anger, hurt, and confusion I'd never seen before. "I know," he said, his voice low and raw. "I know there's someone else." It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. I felt my stomach drop, a chill washing over me as I realized he'd been watching, waiting just as I had. Only this wasn't some jealousy I could easily explain away. It was deeper, sharper. It was the pain of betrayal, a realization that perhaps we hadn't been so honest with each other after all. I sat down across from him, feeling 1,000 things at once. Shame, guilt, confusion. We tried to talk about it, to rationalize what we'd both done and why, but every word felt hollow, every excuse threadbare and brittle. We'd opened the door to something we thought would be simple, freeing even, but instead it had allowed something corrosive to seep in and take root. Each encounter with someone else, each freedom we thought we were gaining, had slowly pulled us further apart until we were standing in the same room, strangers to each other. The worst part was realizing that maybe, after all, I wasn't enough for him. Maybe he wasn't enough for me. Maybe we'd been hiding behind our own insecurities, using others as distractions, band-aids for problems we hadn't even admitted to ourselves. The openness we'd thought would bring us closer had only revealed the fractures in our foundation. I remember lying in bed that night, listening to the silence between us. It was a heavy, accusing silence that seemed to say everything we couldn't. I wanted to reach out, to tell him I was sorry, to promise that I'd fix things. But even as I reached out, the words felt meaningless, too little, too late. We'd both been hurt, and we'd both done the hurting. How could we ever undo that? In the end, the open marriage didn't just test our love. It broke it. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling as his quiet, steady breathing filled the space beside me. The weight of his presence, usually comforting, felt like an iron shackle around my heart. I wanted to cry, to release everything I was feeling, but the tears wouldn't come. I was too numb, trapped in the reality of what we'd done to each other. The room felt colder than usual, and even with him only inches away, I felt more alone than I had in years. The days that followed were a strange blend of routine and tension. We continued our daily lives, exchanging pleasantries and small talk, but there was a hollow quality to everything we did. The silence between us grew like a cancer, something we both knew was there, but didn't have the courage to address. I kept replaying the night we'd agreed to open our marriage, wondering where it all went so wrong, what had led us to this edge of emptiness. I thought about the nights I spent with Damon and the rush I'd felt, the feeling of being wanted, of being something more than a wife, a familiar face in the same routine. But now all those thrilling moments seemed tainted, like pieces of something beautiful that had been shattered beyond repair. Damon reached out to me several times, asking when we could see each other again. But each message felt like salt on an open wound. What was once so exciting now felt wrong. I had told myself that what I had with him didn't have to affect what I shared with my husband, that they were separate parts of my life. But standing there with his text open on my screen, I realized how tangled everything had become. I'd been lying to myself just as much as I'd been lying to him, using Damon to fill a void I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. I didn't respond to Damon's texts, letting them fade into the background as I tried to piece together what was left of my marriage. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I had to break the silence before it suffocated us both. "Do you regret it?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked up from his plate, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the man I'd married, the one who used to look at me like I was the only person in the room. "Do you?" he countered, his tone heavy with bitterness and something else, something sadder. "Yes," I admitted, my voice cracking. I thought this would make us stronger, that it would bring us closer somehow. But all it did was make me realize how far apart we already were. He sighed, pushing his plate away, running his hands over his face. "I guess I thought the same thing. That maybe if we could, I don't know, feel that spark again with other people, it would make what we have feel new. But now," he trailed off, his words lingering in the air between us, unfinished. We sat in that shared understanding, two people who had hurt each other without meaning to. And I felt a flicker of hope, a desperate need to fix what we'd broken. But how? How do you come back from this? How do you put pieces back together when they don't fit the way they used to? Over the next few weeks we tried. We went back to counseling, talking through the moments that had led us to this, dissecting each decision, each word we'd left unspoken. Some days felt like progress. Other days we barely spoke, the weight of our choices hanging over us like a dark cloud. It was exhausting navigating the pain we'd both caused and trying to find some semblance of trust, some reason to keep going. One night, as we lay in bed, he reached for my hand. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental in its simplicity, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had consumed us. I held his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the familiar texture of his fingers entwined with mine. I realized in that moment that despite everything, I still loved him. I wanted to find a way back to him, back to us, even if it meant facing the ugly, broken parts of ourselves that we'd kept hidden. But love, I learned, isn't always enough. As the weeks slipped by, a strange rhythm settled between us, though it was nothing like before. Every touch, every word felt fragile, as if we were moving through the ruins of something we both knew was once beautiful, but was now reduced to rubble. Yet, within that space, a raw honesty began to emerge, like a flickering candle in a darkened room. There were nights we spent talking until dawn, sometimes falling silent for hours, just holding each other, feeling the weight of our shared mistakes. And sometimes we fought, bitterly, passionately, with words that cut deep, surfacing all the resentments and regrets we'd tucked away for so long. I saw in him a depth of pain I hadn't been willing to acknowledge before, an agony that mirrored my own. In those moments, I realized that we had been harboring wounds long before we decided to open our marriage, but neither of us had wanted to confront them. Our therapist encouraged us to look inward, to question why we'd chosen this path, and what needs we were each trying to fulfill. I uncovered layers of myself I hadn't realized existed, fears I hadn't dared to name. I admitted things I'd long hidden, even from myself, that I had felt invisible in my own marriage, that I'd worried deep down that I wasn't enough for him, that I was terrified of being trapped, unloved in the life we'd built together. And he, in turn, confessed his own doubts and insecurities, that he had felt a growing distance between us but hadn't known how to reach across it. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, we sat in the car, too emotionally drained to even start the engine. I could feel the tension in the air, but also something else. An invitation to honesty, a chance to speak truths that had lain buried for years. "You know," he said quietly, his voice rough and hesitant, "there were times even before all this, I wondered if you'd stopped loving me." His words pierced me. I looked at him, searching for something in his expression, and I realized how long he had carried this hurt. "I never stopped loving you," I whispered. I lost my way. I thought if I found excitement somewhere else, it would fill the void. I thought we could do this and come out stronger, that we were somehow different, that we'd be the exception." He looked away, his jaw clenched. "But we weren't the exception. Now? I don't know how to come back from this." Those words, spoken so simply, felt like a slap to my soul. I felt desperation rising in my chest, but no words came. I realized then that fixing our marriage wouldn't be as simple as going to therapy or talking, or even just staying together. We would have to rebuild everything from the ground up, confront all the pain and betrayal we'd both endured, and make a choice every single day to stay. And even then, there were no guarantees. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, something resembling trust began to form between us again. It was tentative, hesitant, like the fragile shoots of a plant growing in rocky soil. We decided to end the open marriage, realizing that it had only highlighted our faults and weaknesses, rather than strengthening us. We made promises to each other, vows to try again, to be more transparent, to love each other despite the scars we'd inflicted. In small ways, we tried to reclaim the intimacy we'd lost. We started going out on date nights again, visiting places we used to love, finding small ways to reconnect. But it wasn't the same. Everything was tinged with the knowledge of what had happened, the memories of other people, other choices, lingering like ghosts in the background. I knew he still thought of her, just as I occasionally thought of Damon, though neither of us dared to mention it. Those other people had become symbols of everything we'd almost lost, reminders of the boundaries we'd foolishly crossed. One night we went to the beach, the place where he had proposed to me years ago. The waves crashed gently against the shore, the salt air thick and heavy, as we stood side by side in silence. He reached for my hand and I felt the familiar warmth, a reminder of all we had shared and all we still had to overcome. "Do you think we can ever be like we were?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. He looked out at the ocean, his eyes distant. "I don't think we'll ever be the same," he replied softly. "But maybe we can be something different. Maybe we can build something new, something stronger." And in that moment I felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, delicate hope that maybe, just maybe, we could survive this. We could rebuild, even if the pieces didn't fit the way they used to, even if the picture looked different from the one we'd imagined all those years ago. The journey wasn't over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning. We still had miles to go, scars to heal, and trust to rebuild. But for the first time in months, I felt a quiet certainty that I was willing to try, that I still loved him enough to stay, to fight for what we once had. Our love, once broken and battered, was being reforged into something else. Something imperfect and raw but real. And for now that was enough. In the weeks that followed that night at the beach, something changed between us. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the way a wound starts to heal beneath the surface before you can see the scar forming. We became softer with each other, more careful. It was as if we were relearning who we were, both as individuals and as a couple, rediscovering the parts of each other that had gotten lost somewhere along the way. Every morning felt like a small test. I would wake up, glance over at him lying next to me and wonder, will today be another day we grow closer? Or would it be one of those silent, tense days where everything feels brittle? I came to learn that recovery doesn't happen in a straight line. Some days felt easy, even lighthearted, and I'd start to believe that maybe we were truly mending. Then without warning we'd hit a snag. A word, a look, a memory that brought the pain surging back. There were times when he'd be looking at me, and I'd catch a flicker of something like sadness or anger. And it cut every time, knowing that he was thinking of her, or of what I'd done with Damon. I could feel the invisible scars running between us, the memories we were both carrying. It was like a dance, learning how to move around the hurt, when to be gentle and when to push. We both knew that there would always be shadows hanging over us, but we tried to live with them, to accept them as part of the new landscape of our lives. One evening as we sat on the couch he reached out, taking my hand. There was something vulnerable in his eyes, a hesitation I hadn't seen before. "I don't want us to pretend this never happened," he said, his voice low and steady. "I want us to be able to talk about it, to own it. If we're going to make it through this, I think we have to be honest about everything. Even the painful parts." My heart tightened. He was asking for something I hadn't fully been prepared to give. A level of honesty that would force us both to confront our own mistakes. But I knew he was right. Sweeping everything under the rug would only leave room for resentment to grow. So, we started having conversations we'd avoided for too long. Little by little, we began peeling back the layers, unearthing all the hurt, fear, and resentment we'd buried. It was brutal at times. He confessed things I wasn't ready to hear, details about her, about what he'd felt and what he'd thought of me during that time. And I, in turn, told him about Damon, about the moments I'd felt something for someone else, something that had once seemed forbidden and impossible. Each conversation felt like exposing a fresh wound, but we could feel it, slowly, painfully bringing us closer. We stopped tiptoeing around the broken pieces and instead began picking them up, holding them up to the light and asking each other, "What do we do with this?" Eventually, we decided to take a weekend trip together, something we hadn't done in years. We chose a cabin a few hours away, deep in the mountains, hoping that the change in scenery might bring us some perspective, some distance from everything that had happened. As we drove through winding roads surrounded by towering trees, there was a strange sense of peace settling over us, as though we were leaving all our baggage behind, even if just for a couple of days. The cabin was small and simple, nestled in a grove of pine trees with a stunning view of the mountains. For the first time in what felt like forever, it was just the two of us, without the daily pressures and distractions that had filled our lives. We spent the first evening in near silence, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in a long time, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that we were new to each other again, two people who hadn't yet inflicted any wounds, who hadn't yet suffered through heartache. That night, as we lay in bed, he reached for me. There was a slowness to his touch, a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. We moved carefully, as if we were handling something fragile and sacred. It was the first time in months that I felt a kind of purity in our connection, a moment unsullied by the memories that had haunted us. When he whispered that he loved me, I believed him fully, deeply, in a way I hadn't allowed myself to believe in a long time. The next morning we woke up tangled together, and for a brief, blissful moment, I forgot about everything that had happened. I was just a woman lying in the arms of the man she loved, feeling safe and whole. But reality returned as it always does. Over breakfast we started talking about the future, about what we wanted, about the kind of marriage we were willing to rebuild. "We can't go back to who we were," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we needed to break to see what was really there." His words struck something deep inside me. In our attempts to save our marriage by opening it, we'd exposed everything we'd both been hiding. We'd put each other through hell. But there was a strange, twisted kind of beauty in what we'd endured. We were different now, and maybe that was okay. We returned home with a renewed sense of commitment, a fragile but genuine resolve to face whatever came next. There would be hard days ahead, we knew that. But there was also a quiet strength between us, something forged in the fire of our mistakes and our forgiveness. In the months that followed, we continued rebuilding slowly, carefully. We took up new hobbies together, filling our lives with things that made us feel alive again. We went on long walks, had spontaneous date nights, and even started cooking together. A simple joy that became a ritual of healing. The scars didn't disappear, but they faded, becoming part of our shared story. A testament to everything we'd survived. One evening, as we were cooking dinner, he looked at me with a soft smile. "Do you think we'll be okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the familiarity of his touch. "I think we already are," I said, my heart swelling with a quiet, unwavering hope. And in that moment I knew that, while we would never be who we once were, we were becoming something even more real. Two people bound by pain, by love, and by the relentless decision to stay and heal no matter how long it took. The days slipped into a rhythm that, for the first time in years, felt natural, easy even. We had crossed through the darkest storm of our lives, and now in its wake, there was a kind of peace that came from knowing we had survived. But peace is a delicate thing, especially when it's built on the ashes of what we'd burned down. In the quiet moments I still felt those lingering shadows, memories of mistakes, old insecurities creeping back in, testing our resolve. There were days when a simple phrase, an old habit, or a certain look would ignite an ember of suspicion, a reminder of the pain we'd both inflicted. But each time those feelings rose up, I reminded myself of the vow I'd made, to let go, to forgive, to trust again. And each time I'd see him also battling his own shadows, reaching for my hand with a quiet assurance that he was here, that he was trying as hard as I was. One night, after a long day of work, we were curled up on the couch, a glass of wine in my hand, his arm draped around my shoulder. We were watching some mindless TV show, barely paying attention, just enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. And then, out of nowhere, he turned to me, a look of deep sadness and regret clouding his eyes. "I still think about her sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The words hung heavy in the air, and I felt that familiar pang of jealousy, the same sharp stab of insecurity. But I forced myself to breathe, to listen, to hear what he was really saying. "It's not that I miss her," he continued, his gaze steady but pained. "It's just, I think I still feel guilty. Guilty that I let it go that far. That I risked us for something that, in the end, meant nothing." He looked away, swallowing hard, and I could see the shame etched into his features. It was a rare vulnerability, a glimpse into the part of him that still hadn't forgiven himself. And in that moment something shifted inside me. I realized that while I'd been so focused on my own pain, my own healing, I hadn't truly seen his. Without saying a word, I placed my hand over his, squeezing gently, hoping that he could feel the forgiveness I'd struggled to offer. I wanted him to know that he didn't have to carry that guilt alone, that I understood now. We'd both made choices that hurt each other, that tore us apart, but we were here, still standing, still trying. And for the first time I felt a deep, genuine compassion for him, for the man who had made mistakes but was fighting every day to make up for them. I knew then that healing wasn't just about letting go of my own hurt. It was about helping him let go of his too. Our life continued on, but with that compassion came a kind of understanding, a bond that hadn't been there before. We were no longer hiding from the past. We were facing it together, unafraid to confront the mistakes and the guilt. And as the weeks passed, those shadows grew fainter. The memories that had once haunted us became softer, less sharp, like scars that had finally begun to heal. One evening, as we were out to dinner, we ran into an old friend who had been there during the early years of our marriage. She greeted us with a warm smile, her eyes sparkling as she took in the sight of us together. "You too," she said with a grin. "Still the perfect couple. What's your secret?" For a moment we exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between us. I felt a flicker of irony, of the unspoken truth of what we'd endured, what we'd almost lost. But I also felt a sense of pride, of gratitude, for the journey we'd taken, for the love we'd fought to protect. "There's no secret," I replied, my voice steady, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Just a lot of work. And a lot of forgiveness." As we walked home that night, hand in hand, I felt a warmth blooming in my chest, a new kind of love growing between us, one born not out of passion or excitement, but out of resilience, of the unbreakable bond we'd formed through all the pain. It was a quiet love, steady and enduring, a love that didn't demand perfection but rather thrived in spite of the imperfections. Months passed, and life settled into something resembling peace. We'd rebuilt our home, piece by piece, and while it wasn't the same as it had been before, it was ours. It was real. We no longer looked to others to fill our empty spaces. Instead, we leaned on each other, knowing that whatever came our way, we would face it together. And sometimes, late at night as we lay in bed, I would look at him and marvel at the journey we'd taken. The journey that had nearly destroyed us but had ultimately brought us closer than I'd ever thought possible. I realized then that love wasn't a feeling. It was a choice, a daily decision to stay, to forgive, to fight for each other, even when it hurt. In the end, we weren't the same people who'd stood at the altar all those years ago, bright-eyed and naive, believing that love would be easy. We were stronger, wiser, and maybe a little scarred. But those scars were part of us now, reminders of everything we'd survived. And I knew with a quiet certainty that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, hand in hand, no longer afraid. As time went on, I found that our relationship, though healed in many ways, had developed a kind of double-sided texture. There were moments when I could sense a distance between us, a tiny reminder of the fractures we had endured, scars that never fully disappeared. We both felt it, I think, like a thread that tugged at us when we least expected it, a lingering trace of mistrust that neither of us would ever fully shake. Yet, on most days I felt more secure, more deeply connected to him than I ever had before. We were bound together, not by some naive expectation of perfection, but by a raw, fierce commitment to each other that had been forged in the fires of our shared mistakes. But just as I began to feel truly comfortable again, life threw us an unexpected curveball that would test everything we had worked so hard to rebuild. It began innocently enough. I was in the kitchen washing dishes one evening, when his phone buzzed on the counter beside me. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. We'd rebuilt a level of trust where I no longer felt compelled to check his messages or wonder who he was talking to. But something about the way he glanced at his phone that night, the hesitation in his movement as he picked it up, caught my attention. He saw me looking, and for a brief moment there was a flash of something in his eyes, guilt maybe? Or perhaps it was just my own fears resurfacing, reminding me of the woman I'd once been, the woman who doubted, questioned, and let insecurities eat away at her. But before I could even ask, he smiled and set his phone back down, dismissing whatever message had come in. "It's just work," he said, his tone light, almost too casual. "Nothing important." I nodded, brushing it off, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Days passed, and I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was overreacting, letting old wounds fester. After all, we'd come so far. I couldn't let myself slip back into the habit of doubting him, doubting us. But then, as if fate was intent on testing me, it happened again. And again. Little moments, small hesitations, his gaze a little too focused on his phone, his attention a little too far away. One evening, as he stepped outside to take a call, I sat there, feeling a deep ache that reminded me of the early days of our open marriage experiment, when I had been haunted by fears of what I was losing. I wanted to shake the feeling, to trust him, to be the woman who could rise above jealousy and insecurities. But something inside me whispered that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't being entirely honest. A week later, my fears culminated in a single shattering moment. I was cleaning up around the house, sorting through our drawers, when I came across a receipt tucked into the pocket of his jacket. It was from a small, intimate restaurant downtown, the kind of place he and I used to go to when we were first dating, cozy and secluded. But the date on the receipt was from last week, a night he'd told me he was working late. My heart pounded, my mind racing with possibilities, each one more painful than the last. I knew that it could have been innocent, a business dinner, maybe even a meal by himself. But the secrecy of it, the fact that he hadn't mentioned it, and the way he'd been acting all week told me otherwise. I was back in the same dark place, the same storm of fear and suspicion I'd thought we'd left behind. When he got home that night, I confronted him, my voice trembling as I held the receipt up between us. He looked at me, his face a mixture of shock and guilt, and for a moment I could see him wrestling with himself, debating what to say, how much to tell me. It wasn't anything serious," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's just someone from work. We went out for dinner, but it was nothing more than that." The words hung in the air, like shards of glass that sliced through me, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. I wanted to believe him, to accept that it was innocent, that he hadn't crossed any lines. But I could feel the tremor in his voice, the hint of something left unsaid. How many times? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. How many times have you gone out with her? He looked away, his silence more damning than any words could have been. My heart sank, a lead weight of betrayal settling in my chest. I felt the ground slipping out from under me, everything we'd rebuilt, all the trust we'd worked so hard to repair, suddenly seeming fragile and breakable. I wanted to scream, to cry, to rage at the unfairness of it all. But instead I stood there frozen, feeling the familiar sting of heartbreak, the pain I'd tried so hard to bury rising up once more. That night we slept in separate rooms, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment, every conversation, every smile we'd shared in the past months. I felt foolish, betrayed, and utterly alone. I had thought we were stronger, that we'd come out the other side of our mistakes with a new understanding, a new commitment to each other. But now all I could feel was the cold, hollow ache of betrayal. Days turned into weeks and we barely spoke, both of us dancing around the chasm that had opened between us. I could feel him trying, making small gestures, apologizing, telling me it hadn't meant anything. But the words felt hollow, his explanations empty. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair, and we were both painfully aware of how fragile it had become. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, he came in and sat down across from me, his face etched with a sadness I hadn't seen before. "I know I've hurt you," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. I know that it seems like we're right back where we started. But I swear to you it didn't mean anything. It was a moment of weakness, a stupid, thoughtless decision. But I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose what we've fought so hard to rebuild." I looked at him, feeling the weight of his words, the sincerity in his eyes. I could see the pain he was carrying, the guilt and shame that had been eating away at him. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something other than anger or hurt. I felt a faint glimmer of hope, a reminder of the love that had once held us together, a love that, despite everything, still lingered between us. But I knew that forgiveness, true forgiveness, wouldn't come easily. We had both made mistakes, both inflicted wounds that would take years to fully heal. We were two flawed, broken people, bound together by love, but also by pain, by regret, by the scars of a past we couldn't escape. "I don't know if I can trust you again," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were." He nodded, his face solemn, as if he already knew that answer. "I don't expect it to be easy," he replied. "But I want to try. I want to be here with you no matter how long it takes." And so we began again, our journey taking yet another turn, deeper and more painful than before. We knew that there would be no quick fixes, no easy answers. It would be a long, arduous path, filled with doubt and fear, but also perhaps with the hope of a love that had been tested and survived. A love that was imperfect, scarred, but still alive. We walked forward step by step, not knowing where it would lead, but willing to try, willing to believe that even the most broken things can still be mended. In the months that followed, we navigated a fragile, often painful path toward something that resembled healing. Our lives became an intricate dance of vulnerability and restraint, of allowing ourselves to feel the depth of our wounds, while also daring to imagine a future beyond them. I could feel us rebuilding slowly, piece by piece, but it was different this time. There was no rush to reclaim the past, no illusion that things would ever return to what they had once been. Instead, our lives found a new rhythm. We became more honest than we'd ever been, even when honesty hurt. Each night we'd sit across from each other, sometimes speaking about the day's smallest details, sometimes plunging into conversations about our deepest fears, our pain, our shame. We confronted our own reflections, seeing the ways we'd each contributed to the fragile state of our love. And I began to realize that this level of honesty was, in its own way, a kind of forgiveness, an acknowledgement of our shared humanity, our inevitable flaws. One evening, after another of these raw, soul-bearing conversations, we found ourselves sitting quietly, the silence around us calm and reassuring. He took my hand, holding it gently, and I could feel the warmth of his touch, the same touch I'd known for years, but with a tenderness that felt new. "I don't know where this road leads," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine with a depth I hadn't seen before. "But I know I want to walk it with you." And in that moment, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act, something to be given or taken away all at once. It was a choice we'd make each day, a commitment to live with our imperfections and trust that, despite everything, we still chose each other. It was learning to love again, not despite our brokenness but because of it. We weren't the same people who had started this journey, and we wouldn't return to who we were. We were something new. A relationship that had been through fire, reshaped by the flames of our own mistakes and the resilience of our love. From that night on, we stopped seeking perfection. We didn't expect to fix each other or undo the past. Instead, we chose to live each day with a renewed awareness of how precious and fragile love is, how easily it can be fractured, and how fiercely it must be protected. And in that awareness, I found a kind of peace I hadn't thought possible. We were imperfect, both scarred and healing, both bound by pain and liberated by forgiveness. But for the first time in a long time, I felt free to love, free to hope, and most importantly, free to trust that this love, though scarred and fragile, was something worth fighting for. And that, after everything, was enough.